So the topic we will be discussing today is an extremely relevant topic. I think every topic we discussed in the past year is relevant, and all these shiurim were geared on halachic issues and not just the pilpul ba'alma. But to my dismay, the topic we will be discussing today is far more than relevant. In a way, I think, benafshenu hadavar. And I always try to express myself in a respectful manner. I never am impulsive, and I never speak in rude language. I always try to be respectful, and Kvod Abrius, and especially Kvod Talmid Chochem, is such an important asset and such an important trait, especially in our times. And I will try to be so today as well. But to my dismay, this is not a sugya in which I could say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. I feel very strongly that it is not Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. And as I will explain today, I think we should all vaccinate. I, Baruch Hashem, last week had the second vaccination. I'm feeling well. My mother is 92 years old and she is vaccinated, and Baruch Hashem, she's feeling well. So if people have special medical issues, they should consult their doctors. I am not a doctor. I am not a scientist. I have some basic intelligence. Maybe I understand a bit more than some other rabbonim about science and medicine, but I never pretend to be a doctor. If you have special issues, consult with your doctor. But generally, what we will be discussing today is, yes, the vaccine. Just as a short introduction, it is a chiyuv diuraisa to stay away from sakana. And this basic chiyuv, its source is in Brochas Daf Lamed Beis, an interesting story that the Gemara tells. Masa b'chosed echod. And this chosed was davening. And a sar, an important personality, a government personality, a minister, happened to pass by. And he greeted him. He said, hello, how do you do? And he did not respond because he was davening. And that minister, that sar, patiently waited till he finished davening. And he said, well, if I would take my sword and I would cut you to pieces, no one will call me to judgment. And in your Torah, the Torah says, and your Torah says, how could you be so reckless not to respond to me in the middle of your davening? And the Chosed asks this minister, if you would have an audience with a king, and a mortal, another person would turn to you to schmooze, would you respond to him? And he said, of course not. I'm standing with a king, and when I am in the presence of the king, I would respond to no one else. And the Chosed says, well, I was in the presence of the king of all kings, of Melech Malchei Amlokim, so how could I respond to a mortal, to a human being? Well, this story had a happy end, not to be taken for granted. But the minister said, you're right. It had a happy end, b'siyata d'shmaya. The Marsha on the spot comments, and he says, well, that was a goyish cup. That was his interpretation of a shomalacho. But when we see the pasuk is not dealing with steering clear from physical danger. It is about avodah zorah. It is about emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Mashal was the greatest of the later commentators of the Achronim. But what the Mashal doesn't bring is that the Rambam does quote these two psukim as the source of Shmiras HaGuf v'HaNefesh. Yes, the Rambam, both the Mishnah Torah and Sefer HaMitzvahs, brings, these are the psukim from which we learn that a person should not put his life in jeopardy, should not put his life in danger. And these are sugis in the entire Shas. Primarily two simonim in Shulchan Aruch. Simen Kuf Tet Zayin Yoredeya and Simen Tov Chov Zayin Cheshmeshbet. So we have two different sources in Shulchan Aruch dealing with these halachas. One deals primarily with Sheval Taisa and the other with Kum V'asei. On one hand, Simakuf Tozain, we learn the din of Gilui. One should not drink water that was exposed without supervision, and many other halachas in which we learn a person should not put his life in jeopardy. You should not stand under a wall that is leaning and it seems to be apt to fall. So could one go visit the Tower of Pisa? Well, it's somewhat leaning. And the Gemara says one should not go under a Kir Natui. Well, that wall has been leaning for almost 400 years and it still didn't fall. So probably Al Pi Halacha, if you want to visit a positive Pisa, you should stand on the other side, not on the side where it might fall, but rather on the other side. So on Simakuf Tezayin in Yoredeya, that is one aspect of Shmiras Haguf VaNefesh, steer clear from Sekona. Tov Chov Zayin in Choshe Mishpat. Agav, it's the only siman in Shulchan Aruch which you would not find in Tur. So the Tur Choshe Mishpat ends off in Tov Chov Vav. And the Beis Yosef added on one more siman, Tov Chov Zayin. And those are the dinam of Makkah and staying away from Sekona. From Mitzvahs Makkah, we learn that it is not only b'sheval taisa, not only in a passive way, but you need to initiate and you need to do, and you need to do whatever it takes to be done to prevent Sekona. Not only to avoid, but also to prevent. And that is the aside that we learn from Mitzvahs Makkah. The Torah says, not only don't go to the edge of the roof, stay away. No, you need to build a Micah. So in Shmiras Haguf Nefesh, in this entire era of the pandemic, for 10 months, we've been talking primarily about staying away from Sekona, wear masks, keep social distancing, keep your hands clean. Now we reach the stage in which we are required to kum v'asei, and not only sheval taisa, vaccinate. Ultimately, it is the only way, b'derech hateva, we could get over this and get out of this pandemic. So in Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, it's amazing. More than 2 million people were already vaccinated. And that is almost 30% of the population of this country, which is an amazing success. I know the situation in America is much, you have so much to learn. And I know it's very problematic and very difficult to get vaccinated, but I think there is importance in today's year. And we hope that in the very near future, they will start giving, in a mass scale, vaccinating the population in the East Coast, in New York, and in other places in America. We very much hope so. So let us discuss how Gedolei Yisrael related to vaccination. Ein kol chodesh tachas hashemesh. And in every question in halacha we need to deal with, first and foremost, before saying our own svoros and before looking for our own sources in Shas, we follow what did Gedolei Yisrael throughout the ages say about vaccinations. So the very first vaccine for smallpox was developed by a British doctor named Edward Jenner. I think it was 1796, Tov Kuf Nun Vav, approximately 225 years ago. Who was Edward Jenner? He was a British physician and scientist. The Teferes Yisrael and Perek Gimel in Masechet Weiss, when the Mishnah says, Chavev Odom Shenivro B'Tzelem, and the Teferes Yisrael follows in the footsteps of the Tosfos Yom Tov and all the other great Meforshim of Mishnayos. And their pshat in the Mishnah is, Chavev Odom Shenivro B'Tzelem. That refers to every human being. Adam is every human being. Yes, we are unique. We stand apart. We are Kadosh Baruch Hu's chosen people. And that is what the Mishnah stresses in the second part of the Mishnah. Chavivin Yisrael shenikru bonim lemokoim. Chibi Yosera noidas lehem liyisrael shenikru bonim lemokoim. Chavivin Yisrael shenitan lehem klei chemdo. Chibi Yosera noidas lehem liyisrael shenitan lehem klei chemdo. Yes, we alone are a Kodesh Baruch Hu's family. We are bonim lemokoim. All the others are precious. They were all created b'tzelem Elokim. But it is we and only we that are family, that are Kodesh Baruch Hu's children. And why is that? Chavivin Yisol shenikra bonim lemokoim. That is because Chavivin Yisol shenitan lohem kli chemdo. Because we are the ones. She'omdu raglo avoseinu al har Sinai, and we're the ones that receive Torah Hashem. So, when the Meforshim, all the Meforshim besides Reb Chaim Vital, but this is a sugya I don't want to get into today, but it's Yedias Nechbodos. The Medrash Shmuel, one of the most important Meforshim on Masechet Avos, was a Talmud of Reb Chaim Vital, who was the greatest disciple of the Ariya Kodesh. So Reb Chaim Vital and the Bala Kabul are the only ones that say Tzelem Elokim is only Bnei Yisrael. Non-Jews don't have a Tzelem Elokim. That is Reb Chaim Vital Api Kabbalah. All the classic Meforshim of the Mishnah say the Reisha of the Mishnah, Chol Avodim Shenivra B'Tzelem, refers to every human being, not only to Jews. So that the Tiferes Yisrael on that Mishnah writes that Chasidei Umasu Olam are precious, and they will have a chelik b'olam haba. And he quotes a few names. The first name he quotes is HaChosed Yener, referring to Dr. Edward Jenner. HaChosed Yener. He was the one that discovered the vaccine to smallpox. Tens of thousands of people, their lives were saved and salvaged in his merit. And he definitely is a chosed, chasida u'mes olam, and he will have a chelik li'olam haba. So, the Tiferes Yisrael obviously admired Edward Jenner and admired his accomplishment in developing the vaccine. But in Masechet Avos, he doesn't discuss should one take the vaccine or not. He does discuss this question in another source in Tiferes Yisrael Perek Ches in Masechet Yuma. So the first three Gedolim that dealt with the question, should one take the vaccine or not, were the Tiferes Yisrael, Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol. Now, Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol was one of the Asor HaRugi Malchus. But Shabbos Teshuvah Zera Emes was authored by one of the great Gedolim in Turkey, Rabbi Yishmael HaKohen. And he was one of the greatest halachic sources, one of the greatest Poiskei Halacha, going back almost 250 years in that same era, in real time when the vaccine was developed. So, Shabbos Teshuvah Zera Emes, Tiferes Yisrael, Zera Emes is Chelik Beis Simen Lamed Beis, Tiferes Yisrael Perek Ches Masechet Yuma, and Rabbi Elazar Fleckels, the great Talmud of the Noda B'Yehuda in Shabbos Teshuvah Tshuva Me'ahava. What is their discussion? Another sefer came out 1 year after this vaccine was developed. It's a small kuntres named Alim Litrufo, and it was written by a choshev HaRav, Rav Avram Hamburg, and he was a Rav in London and in Hague in Holland. He lost 2 children to smallpox, so it's no wonder that he appreciated the vaccine. And he wrote this kuntres, Alim Litrufo, and he brings various different opinions of Rabbonei Hazman. Should one take the vaccine or should one abstain from taking the vaccine? So most of the tshuvas he quotes are for and not against. What was the shaila? So the Zera Emes says some people die after taking this vaccine, so it is a danger. However, it is obvious that if we don't take the vaccine, many more people will die. So the halachic discussion was, should one put his life in immediate jeopardy, in immediate danger, which is a minimal risk to prevent maybe at a later stage exposing himself to a greater risk. And this is a real halachic discussion. In my Sforim, I dealt at great length with a similar question, similar but not the same. Is a person required to put his life in a minimal level of jeopardy to save another person from a great sakana? That is a major discussion in halacha. Halacha lamaisa, a person is not required to put his life in jeopardy at all, even though it's a smaller risk to save another person from a far greater danger. However, when the risk a person takes upon himself is extremely remote and the danger he is trying to save another person from is imminent and it's a great danger, the Radbaz writes it's a midas chasidus. Minchas Osha, Shalos Chuvas, Chelik Aleph, Chelik Beis. There are many chuvas dealing with these questions. There's a section in Shalos Chuvas Minchas Osha, which is Halacha V'Rafua. After Orechaim, Yoredeya, Even Ezech, Mishpat, there's a separate section, Halacha V'Rafua. I don't want to get into this now because it's not really directly associated with our sugya today. I just am drawing a comparison. So we are dealing, and that is what the Zera Emes dealt with. In their day and age, taking the vaccine was a real danger, and people died after taking the vaccine. Nevertheless, all those three Gedolim recommend take the vaccine. You might be putting yourself in immediate danger, but if we don't take the vaccine, the danger is far greater. And therefore, both three of these Gedolim, as well as the Alam L'Trufo, I don't put the Alam L'Trufo in the same category as the Zera Emes, Teferes Yisrael, and Abroza Fleckels. They were three great Gedolim. We don't know much about Rabbi Avram Hamburg, but he definitely wasn't one of the greatest Gedolim of his time. He was a Rav. The Sefer is not on a very high level of lumdis, of discussion, but it is an important Sefer. It's a very important historic document written in real time. But these three great Gedolim all come to the same conclusion. We should vaccinate. So let me tell you about the Zera Emes. He was Rabbi Shmuel HaKohen. Well, he's known as one of the great poskim, and he is quoted extensively by all the Achronim following his time. But just as a historic curiosity, he formulated the manifesto of Napoleon's Sanhedrin. Napoleon Bonaparte, the great conqueror, had his crazy idea of putting up a Sanhedrin. And he established the Jewish Sanhedrin in Paris. Reb David Zinsheim was the Rosh Sanhedrin. Most of the Gedolim just laughed it away. We cannot put up a Sanhedrin. So Napoleon Bonaparte invited the Zera Emes to come to his asifa, to his big conference establishing the Sanhedrin. And Rabbi Shmuel HaKohen wrote a letter of apology. I am old, I'm ill, I can't come. But he wrote a nice letter. And then the manifesto or the takanon of the Sanhedrin was based on the ideas presented by Rabbi Shmuel HaKohen. That is just an interesting piece of history. So the Zera Emes has a correspondence with one of the Rabbonim of his time was named Reb Chaim Yehuda Giron. So Rav Giron turned to the Zera Emes and he said, I am confused and I don't know what to say. And therefore, Shevel Taisa, I don't say anything about the vaccine, for or against. And the Zera Emes has a lengthy discussion dealing precisely with the question I explained a few moments ago. Is it the right thing to put yourself in danger? Biyodayim, taking the vaccine puts your life in danger. But it's just putting your life in a minimal danger to prevent a greater danger tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. The ZMS writes, I think one should take the vaccine. And then Rav Giron writes him a second letter, and he said, I'm not convinced. And I just want your permission to keep shut, not to say anything to my B'nai Kehillah, not for, not against. And the Zeta Emes agrees, and he writes, if you don't feel comfortable encouraging people to take the vaccine, you have the right to just shy away and don't give a psak at all. But it is clear in both tshuvas of the Zeta Emes that his opinion is one should take the vaccine. Now, let me make this clear. In all this forum dealing with this question going back more than 200 years, it is clear that a substantial number of people died after taking the vaccine. And it should be no wonder. Medicine has advanced in the past 200 years. Biology has advanced, techniques have advanced. Nothing is the same as it was 200 years ago. One generation after the Zera Emes, Rabbi Abdallah Sumech, in his Choshev Sefer Zivchei Tzedek and Yoredei Semekuf Tezayin, he is far more powerful in his language than the Zera Emes, and he says, Ma'asem b'chol yom, that people are vaccinated and no one dies, and it's a chiyuv to vaccinate. And that goes back more than 150 years in Zivchei Tzedek. One of the great Talmidim of the Zivchei Tzedek was the Kaf HaChaim. And the Kaf HaChaim in Yoredei Kuf Tezayin is even more forceful than the Zivchei Tzedek than his Rebbe was. And it's amusing. The Kaf HaChaim is in Kuf Tezayin, I think it's Sif Kotten Samach, describes how they vaccinate. They push a needle into your upper arm, exactly the way they vaccinate today. So it goes back many years. So the Kaf HaChaim, Reb Chaim Palachi and Sefer Tochach Chaim Parshas V'Yetzei, Zivchei Tzedek, Kaf HaChaim, Yoredei Kuf Tezayin, and the very first generation, Samuch V'Nera to Edward Jenner, to the first development of the vaccine. Three Gedolim deal with the question, and they all are for vaccination. Many years transpired, and I, once again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist, but I do want to quote the Rashba in Mishmeres HaBayis, which is very important. Bayis Dalet Shar Aleph. It's Daf Tet in Mishmeres HaBayis. And the Rashba writes, Anu soimchem ala chachomim, habikim bahalocha, habikim betivim, va'aleim anu samchum bezeh kamo bedinei klifa, v'kfela, v'bekol inyone isa v'heter. And this is an interesting glossation in the Rashba. Adonenu HaRashba. We rely on the chachomim habikim bahalocha, habikim betivim. Now, I don't think HaRav should be a doctor. He doesn't need to be a doctor. He shouldn't be a doctor. Well, the Rambam was a physician. The Rambam was not only a physician, he was one of the greatest physicians of his time. And he was the chief doctor of the Sultan in Mitzrayim. But that was many years ago. Gedolei Torah should dedicate their lives to Torah, and only to Torah. We expect Gedolei Ador to learn Torah Yoimon V'Layla. Min Arusa ad Zikna V'Seiva. But the Rashba does write, Anu Soimchem Al Chachomim HaBekiyim Balocha Bekiyim V'Tiviyim, and I think that HaRav, dealing with questions of Pikuach Nefesh, should have some fundamental understanding and intelligence to understand the subject matter. And why do I say this? Because there are some psukim and shuvas written by Choshev Rabbanim that were very embarrassing. And I say this, I am pained to say this. And I say it with trepidation, but some of the shuvas written were very embarrassing when it was so obvious that the Rabbanim just didn't understand what they're talking about. So I once again say, a Gadol b'Torah should dedicate his life to Torah and only to Torah. But it is important, I'm using an expression of Chazal, kadem mizber elohu savri. They should at least understand what is explained to them. Because in some areas, you cannot give a psak without understanding what you're dealing with. Is it legitimate for Rabbanim to question what doctors say? It is legitimate, yes. And I want to bring a fascinating example. Going back more than 300 years, Shabbos Teshuvas Knesses Yecheskel, Rabbi Yecheskel Katzenelbogen was the Gadol Hador. No generation had one Gadol Hador. Every generation has many Gedolim. So when I quote the Knesset Yecheskel, the Gadol Hador, he wasn't the only one. He was a contemporary of the Shvus Yankov, of the Chacham Tzvi. There were many Gedolim in that day and age, the Chavas Yoyo. But he definitely was one of the greatest, a giant among giants. So the Knesset Yecheskel and Siman Tet Zayin has an interesting tshuva. It takes us all the way back to Perek Rabbi Eliezer the Mila in Masechet Shabbos. In days of yore, it was accepted practice that right after the bris, we wash the baby and the Ever Hamila with hot water. And therefore, the Gemara says, if we did a bris, we should prepare hot water for Me'av Shabbos. If the kettle was turned over, we would boil water on Shabbos because it's Pikuach Nefesh. Comes along the Beis Yosef and Siman Shin Lamed Aleph, and he says, we no longer do that. And there's no longer a need. And present day medicine say, we don't wash babies with hot water after the bris. And my dear friends, we don't do that today either. No male takes boiling water, hot water to wash the bris. So the Beis Yosef says, in our day and age, it's also a vasal mayim. It's a malacha, and it has nothing to do with Pikuach Nefesh. In the days of Reb Cheskel Katzenelbogen, 250 years, or 150 years after the Beis Yosef, it was a time of Megeif, a time of a pandemic. And the doctors in a certain town said, because of kilkul avir, because the air is bad, there once again is a need to have hot water when you do a bris. So we should warm water, cook water on Shabbos if we have a bris and we did not prepare water from Erev Shabbos. And the Knesset Yecheskel was asked what he says. Should we? And he says, I don't think the doctor knows what he's talking about. And I doubt doctors know anything about kilkul avir. And I think we should follow the psak of the Beis Yosef. And we should not boil water. So the Knesset Yecheskel took the liberty to question the science. So yes, sometimes a Gadol B'Yisrael has the right to question scientific data that's presented to him. But what is so important to note, 150 years transpired, and we find a tshuva. In Shabbos Teshuvas Mamer Mordechai, Reb Mordechai Zev Ettinger, a brother-in-law of Rabbi Yosef Shor Natanzon, one of the great Gedolim and Poskim of his era in Sun and Samach Zayin. What is he dealing with? He is dealing with a psak many Gedolim gave in his time, that in the time of the cholera Mageifa, not corona, but cholera. In the time of the cholera Magay, many Gedolim Paskin that even the healthy people should eat on Tisha B'Av. Why? Kilkelu avio. So the Mama Mordechai quotes the Knesset Yecheskel, and he writes, the Knesset Yecheskel questioned whether doctors know anything about Kilkelu avio. So I also cast doubt on what the doctors say. However, I remember, and this shuv I think was written in Tov Reish Lamed Gimel, Tov Kof Tzudek Aleph, 40 years ago, we had the same question in Lemberg, and my great uncle, Yeshuas Yankov, Rabbi Yankov Orenstein Paskin, they should all go and eat. So he does quote the Knesset Yecheskel, but he says, no, we should be makel and follow what the doctors say. Let me make a comment. I think the Knesset Yecheskel was so right by questioning what that doctor said. Because if you ask me what the doctor said is totally ridiculous, and it doesn't make sense. What does kilkola avir and a megefa have to do with washing a bris with hot water? We could understand that in a time of a pandemic, we need to eat, we need to drink, we need to nourish our bodies. But rinsing the bris with hot water, why would that have to do anything with a pandemic? What does it have to do with kilkola avir? If the doctor would say, well, the moil did mitzitza, and maybe he carries these germs, so we need urgently to disinfect the wound, that might make sense. But what does it have to do with kilkelu avia? One of the things we learned during this pandemic is the fact that a person is a PhD doesn't make him sane. And the fact that a person is a doctor doesn't necessarily say he's normal. And I don't offend doctors. Some of my greatest fans are doctors, and I admire many of them. But one of the things we learned during this pandemic, that there is so much material out there, which is insane. And some of the crazy material is written by doctors and professors and PhDs. So I think the Knesset Yecheskel applied common sense. And he wrote, doesn't seem reasonable to me. Because kilkel or avia, you need hot water to rinse the bris. No, I think we could rely on the Beis Yosef. And the Mama Mordechai was so sensible when he said, our question is also about kilkel or avia, but it's not the same as what the Knesset Yecheskel dealt with. And I think we should follow the doctors, what they say, that maybe it is important for people to eat at the cholera outbreak. So I don't want to, in my Sefer on Corona, which is expected very, very shortly, I know it's late, and I very much hope by the time the Sefer comes out, it won't be relevant anymore. I hope so. But it still is a fascinating halachic Sefer. So I dealt with the question about fasting. It's not what we're dealing with today. What I just wanted to point out is Rabbonim should apply common sense. And the Knesset Yecheskel, which is also extremely important, he says, the Knesset Yecheskel says, I think that doctor is talking nonsense. We should consult greater doctors and more reliable medical authorities. So he's not mezelzel in doctors. He just questions the sensibility of what that doctor or those doctors said, and he recommends, let's hear what bigger doctors have to say. And that has so much appeal to me. So let me make an extremely fundamental argument. As Rabbi Garazman suggested, maybe we should dedicate a special shir on the fundamental question, how does halacha relate to scientific data? Because there are so many areas in halacha which the halacha depends on science. So, do we accept what scientists, what researchers, what mumchim, what doctors say? It's not only about Pikuach Nefesh. I wrote a tshuva in which I dealt with 10 different areas of halacha. 10 different areas of halacha. Even Ezer Choshe Mishpat Orachayim Yoredeya. In all Dalet Chelkei Shulchan Aruch, there are so many areas in halacha in which the posek is essentially dependent on information that we need to feed him, information that he needs to receive, and he has nowhere to receive that information, only from scientists, doctors, and lav dafke doctors. And halacha always relies on information. So I want to make a very fundamental argument. Halacha relies on mainstream opinions because we do not expect the Rav to be a scientist. We do not expect the posek to be familiar in biology, zoology, botanics, and I'm just meramis to kilayim, isa veheter, blias. So the Rav is not a chemist, he's not a biologist, he's not a zoologist. So we need to rely on scientific information. Halacha deals clearly with a matzav, with a situation in which doctors have conflicting opinions. So what do? Tov Reish Yud Ches Siv Gimel, Mishnah Berurah Siv Koten Yud. When there are conflicting opinions, we rely on the majority. Just like in Sanhedrin, just like in Halacha Yochid V'Rabim, Halacha Kerabim. If there are conflicting opinions between doctors, we rely on the Rav. Now, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't deal with macro; he deals with micro. There's a Choyle B'Yom HaKippurim. One doctor says he needs to eat. Many doctors say there is no need. We go b'sarayv. So in our day and age, it's not a choyle mesuyim, a person lying in bed and 5 doctors came to see him. One says he should, 4 say he shouldn't, or the other way around. We're dealing with macro, not with micro. We're dealing with an epidemic. So the Mishnah Berurah says, either we rely on the majority or on those that are more qualified, those that are greater mumchim. So we would rely on a big professor that has many years of experience and expertise, and he has a great reputation, and not on a young family doctor who just finished medical school. So these are the 2 criteria which determine how is a posek supposed to act when there are different and conflicting medical opinions. Halacha relies on mainstream opinions. Could they make mistakes? Of course they could. We all could make mistakes. Even though in the modern world, the medical establishment is extremely diligent. And even the COVID vaccine, yes, it was rushed. It was a necessity to rush it through. But there are many different and independent bodies that go over the information, the data, the research, the processes before it is given out to the public. In my humble opinion, by the little I understand about medicine and science, and I discussed this with many prominent doctors and scientists, this is one of the safest vaccines ever produced. Let's just discuss the numbers. More than 2 million people have been vaccinated in Eretz Yisrael already. More than 100,000 got the second dose. We're not aware of one death that could be linked to the vaccine. We're not aware of any life-threatening symptoms linked to the vaccine. Yes, few people died a day after taking the vaccine. But if 2 million people will eat chont, some of them will die a day after eating chont. Or maybe that's not a good example because chont isn't that healthy. So let's give another example. If 2 million people will go to the mikveh, some of them will die a day after going to the mikveh. Because statistically, that's an awesome number. But we're not aware of anyone that died as a result of taking the vaccine or anyone that developed life-threatening symptoms after taking the vaccine. So I know there's a lot of fake information in the internet about people dying and terrible things happening after vaccination. This is one of the safest vaccines, but I'm not trying to convince anyone as a doctor or as a scientist. No, I don't want to do that. I'm a poisek. And all my arguments are halachic arguments. Chazal teach us a principle of shomer pesoim Hashem. In Minchas Osher, Parshas Devorim, I don't remember which siman, there's a siman about Shmiras Haguva and Nefesh. And the posik v'nishmartem moed lenafsheseichem. And part of that siman deals with shomer pesoim Hashem. Shomer pesoim Hashem means if you follow mainstream, if you do what people do, and you act in a responsible way, then shomer pesoim Hashem. A few years ago, I had a discussion with one of the great gedolim in America about the triple vaccine. That was before COVID. And I made this argument. I said, shomer pesoim Hashem. Even if chas v'sholem, they make a mistake. But what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to follow the minority opinions, the anti-vaccinations? As a poisek, it is what Chazal did, it was the Gedolim did in every day and age. So maybe next week I will elaborate about many, many different areas in which halacha is based on science, which is what we have. So if a person and a poisek follow mainstream medical opinions, I don't think they're mistaken. I think the process of verification and authorization is the best possible. But if chas v'sholem they're mistaken, shomer pesoim Hashem. It is all we could do. It is what Chazal did 2,000 years ago. It's what the Rishonim and the Achronim did. All they could do is consult doctors, and they relied always on the opinion of the majority of the establishment of mainstream. Could they be making mistakes? Very unlikely, very unreasonable. I think we could say with certainty that they're not making mistakes, but even if yes, shomer pesoim Hashem. So before we say goodbye, let me just say this. To my dismay, ein lochi yom she'ein kilalosam eruah mishal chavata. In Etzisona, in the last week, 50 Haredim died. Hundreds of people died. People are dying every day from COVID, every day. A 38-year-old mother died. A 31-year-old, I think. She had a premature baby, a C-section, and the baby died. And the mother is in critical condition, COVID. We're losing people every day. And in America, the matzav is far worse than it was some time ago. I don't want to mention names because of their privacy, but one of my closest friends, a wonderful ish chesed, learned with me in cheder in yeshiva, and he's ill. and I hope HaKadosh Baruch Hu will send them a refuah shalema. People are dying in America. So in Eretz Yisrael, we had 500,000 COVID cases. 4,000 people died out of 500,000. Tens of thousands are suffering. 2 million people were vaccinated. None of them died. So the numbers speak for themselves. And therefore, my opinion is, yes, we should vaccinate. And this is a clear halachic psak that I give, and I hope I explain the psak. And the Gedolim 200 years ago and 150 years ago and 100 years ago that Paskin one should vaccinate. The psak was far more difficult than for us, because in those times, people died from the vaccination. It was very clear. They didn't have clear numbers because they didn't do statistics. But it's obvious from the Zera Emes and from the other Svarim, there was a substantial number of people that died as a result of vaccination. The Afro Pecan, their psak was, one should vaccinate. Because if we don't, the danger is far greater. Kal v'chomer, ben beno shel kal v'chomer, that would be the psak today. Because the risk is totally insignificant. And the risk by not vaccinating is very bad. It's very bad. And b'derech hateva, the only way we will be able to overcome this pandemic is by vaccination. So that is the psak I give to everyone that listens to me. Baruch Hashem, in Eretz Yisrael, we're going full blast ahead. I don't know why in America it's taking so long and the bureaucracy is awful, but I very much hope that in America the vaccine will become available to all in a very short period. Let us not forget the Pasuk in Sefer Tehillim. Im Hashem lo yivna bayis shavamru boinav boy, Im Hashem lo yishma yeshav shakid shoyma. So we need to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the vaccine, because nobody believed it'll be available so fast. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Choinen Das to all those scientists and researchers that developed the vaccine. And we need to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should watch over us. He should send her for Shalem Elachol HaCholim, and she should be Machazik Shmurei Leiv, and he should take this Magefa away. So I wish you all the best.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay, yes.
Okay, follow-ups. First of all, someone asked Shaila, I'm going to go, I think, from what's a Kal Chaimer here. Someone asked Shaila if he's an oval. Shas, the week of Avelis, and he would get it scheduled for a shot. Is he allowed to get up and go take the shot? All these are, as the Rav mentioned here, the distribution is broken down for a variety of reasons, which, as the Rav said, the Rabbanim don't have to go into, and you may not get a shot for a long time. And
then he definitely should leave his home to be vaccinated. And Ovel shouldn't leave his home for the fun of it. But if there is a real need, then Ovel could leave his home. So to get vaccinated, yes, he should leave his home and get vaccinated.
Okay. Is there a difference between dose 1 and dose 2? I know the Metzias here is all the question, but let's assume that dose 1 gives you 50% protection. Again, we don't know a lot about this, but is there a difference?
There's no difference between number 1 and number 2. 50% protection is not enough. So it is not clear how much protection you have of dose 1. Is it 50%? Is it 60%? We need the maximum protection. So an Ovel could leave his house even to get the second dose.
Okay. What are the Hilchos Kedima in assuming that a from institution controlled a certain amount of vaccines, which could happen in the near future? Is there halachically Dinei Kedima? The government has their own set of Kedimais, some of them which make sense, some which don't. What under Allah is Dine Kedima?
Uh, I don't know what the rules are in America, but I think the government rules in Israel make a lot of sense. Number one on the list are medical workers in old age homes, and hospitals. And I agree with that even by halachic standard, because first of all, for two reasons. Their life is at a greater risk because they deal with patients and they might have greater exposure. And, in Shari Tzedek, we have a problem because many medical professionals, doctors, nurses, other workers are either ill or in isolation, and it's a real strain on the hospital. So I think there are two reasons to give Dina Kedima, first of all, to medical staff. Aleph, they're in greater jeopardy. And Bays, Rabim Tzrichim Loi. If they fall ill, it affects others. And second on the list are elderly people, people that have medical issues. Those people that if chas v'shalom they get COVID, they are in a very high risk bracket. And those that are high risk by COVID are not necessarily in high risk for vaccination. It's not the same. So I think the elderly, the ill, the feeble, they should have din kedima, and people working in hospitals and old age homes and people who have more exposure to the virus and people who treat the ill. And if many of them will fall ill, then it might affect the life and the health of others. So I think those are the primary people. But I also think that when time comes, young people should vaccinate. They definitely should. First of all, even if they might take it in stride, but if young people are infected, then they will infect others. And even young people are dying, not at the same rate, not the same numbers, but no one is totally safe from COVID. In the past few weeks, we had a very substantial number of people in their 30s and 40s that passed away in Israel.
Tell me, the Chacham have any Kedima in this situation?
That is a very, very touchy question. So there's a Mishnah at the end of Weiss. I think the Mishnah is not relevant when we have medical dina kedima. The Mishnah is when, for the medical point of view, there is no kedima. So the only Seder kedima we have deals with who the individuals are. And in that case, a kohen comes before Levi, and a Levi before Yisrael, Ishlifnei Yishu, Talmud Chochem before Amma Oretz. But when we have medical criteria to define the Kadima, I think that would be the only criteria to define the Dina Kadima.
Okay, one more touchy set of questions. Can a school, yeshiva, and or a shul bar people from either students or mispalim if they decided that they want to bar non-vaccination? Is that halachically mutter?
I am so careful. Let me say this regarding the vaccination for measles, what is defined, and it's a sort of the triple vaccine, measles, I think it's rubella, and mumps, I don't know exactly. I know it's measles. I did paskin that a school has the right to bar children that are not vaccinated. Would I say the same regarding COVID? I want to be very careful. I don't know what local rabbonim say. There's a limit to how much I need to say about what schools should do in another country. I want to leave it up to the local rabbonim. What I do say is regarding the children vaccinations, I did paskin that a school has the right to refuse entry to children that aren't vaccinated.
Okay, we received a number of questions, which I think are Matthias questions about what about people who already had COVID, they have the same obligation to vaccinate. I think
Reb Stein, I don't hear you well. I don't hear you well.
I'm saying we got several questions about what happened about people who already had COVID. Do they also have a chiyuv to vaccinate? I think this is a more medical question than a rabbinic
Yes,
question.
I am so careful. I don't want to come across as a doctor. I am not a doctor. So medical questions should be presented to doctors. Okay, it was a pleasure with you, and yeah, I could just daven Yeheravo the Nema Milsa de Miscablo. And if I will have the schus of saving one family, two families, three families from tragedy and from shivro and leiv, yehi ze schori. This is a schus I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Kodesh Baruch Hu send refuas and Yeshuas. We should only hear b'seiros toivos.